Hey everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of videos that I'm going to be making for the final exam review for Global 9. Okay, so this will cover quite a bit in the series of these videos, and let's just jump into it with the first one, with an introduction to history and geography. Okay, so before we get into any type of chronological, content, before we get into any of the empires or anything like that, first let's talk about some basics of history and geography. First, people that are involved in the studying of history and the compiling of that enormous textbook that we've been using all year, they're referred to as social scientists, and there are a couple of different ones. First and foremost, you have historians. Historians are people that deal in history, and history is anything that happened in the past, right? So whether you're dealing in something that happened relatively recently, in the last 10 years, or something that happened 10,000 years ago, technically it's all history. So historians are people that will focus on those. Geographers, people that focus with geography. Geography is the study of the earth, specifically the surface of the earth. Now you have different categories of geography. You can have political geography, that studies how man divides up the globe into nations and states and things of that nature. You have physical geography that can study the physical surface of the world. But basically when we're talking about geography, we're looking at maps. We're talking about all the different ways in which humans can interact on the surface of the planet. Speaking of human interaction, you also have anthropologists. Anthropology is a pretty broad field, but anthropologists study about the origins and development of people in their societies, and that can be through studying people today, particularly in more traditional economies and societies, or about studying the past. Now, a way that we can study the past is by looking at artifacts, by kind of literally digging for them, and the people that really specialize in that are archaeologists. Right? Archaeology is the study of past people and culture through their material remains. Now, we think of archaeologists as being kind of romanticized through Indiana Jones, right? But your typical archaeologist is not walking around with a fedora bullwhip fighting Nazis. They do spend an awful lot of time painstakingly combing through dirt and remains and looking up, simple things such as arrowheads or sometimes even human remains. There's an awful lot that you can learn about the way people lived through the skeletons and the way that people cared for their dead and buried themselves. And so those are your four major social scientists. It's also important to understand that you have different types of historical sources. Historical sources get broken down into two categories. The first one are called primary sources. Primary sources are directly from the source, right? So these are things such as journals, autobiographies, eyewitness accounts, not secondhand information. Those we refer to as secondary sources. Secondary sources can be scholarly books. Textbooks are an example of scholarly books, right? They are written. Now, you can have primary sources within secondary sources, right? Your textbook has an awful lot of excerpts from primary sources, but as a whole, the textbook is written by historians. It's written by people about events. That's a secondary source. All right, so even a very detailed scholarly book is still a secondary source. Media articles as well. Again, you can have an eyewitness account in there, but media accounts, whether it's a blog, whether it's a actual news coverage like television coverage or just an old-fashioned newspaper article, those are generally speaking secondary sources. So it's important to understand the difference between primary and secondary sources. All right, so let's get into the dawn of history, or at least the dawn of human history, because this planet predates humans by quite a few billion years. But humans were talking in the tens of thousands, and we'll start off with the Neolithic Age. Now, if we're talking about old caveman times, that's the Paleolithic Age, but we're going to start talking about in the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. All right, so Neo refers to New Stone Age. Now, we're generally speaking in this time frame about 8,000 to 3,000 BC. Now, you notice that is a pretty big time frame of roughly 5,000 years. And you think, well, why is it that it's so wide? Why can't we narrow it down? Because they didn't have written records and because we don't have time machines that we can go back and exactly pinpoint this data. It's best guesses, or what we call guesstimates at this point, based on the work of archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, those social scientists that we talked about on the first slide. Now, some key developments to remember in the Neolithic Age. This was during the time that humans first discovered agriculture. And remember, agriculture is just a fancy term for farming. This is your typical Neolithic village. Now, when you first look at it, you think, okay, this is still very primitive. We're still looking at barely above caveman times. But there are a couple of developments worth noting. One, the use of tools. Right, you see just something simple as a curved blade, a scythe that they use for cutting down some wheat. You notice the use of a stone or some type of metal on the end of this. It could be for a hammer, it could be for another gardening tool, it could be a weapon. So you notice that there is agriculture, there's farming going on, even though that it is very, very kind of low scale and primitive. The other thing, the domestication of animals. All right, those are the two major things that we're looking at with agriculture. And because of this, humans began switching from a nomadic way of life. Nomadic means that you are constantly moving around from place to place. All right, nomads lived lives as hunters and gatherers. All right, they were constantly in search for food. Agriculture allows people to become settled. It allows them to form villages that will eventually expand into towns and cities. Farming also leads to surpluses. A surplus is when you have more of something than you need. And what is the general rule that we've been talking about all year? More food equals more people. So surpluses equal population increase. Okay? So all of these are very, very important key developments of what we call the Neolithic Revolution. All right, this whole period, the Neolithic Revolution, people figured out how to farm. They figured out how to domesticate animals. It allowed them to become settled into settled communities, and it allowed for population growth. Now, this does not mean that overnight every human on the planet figured this out. This was in small pockets all over the globe, and it took centuries for this scene here, to develop into larger cities and civilizations. Now, let's talk about civilizations. There is a checklist of things that you need in order to be considered a civilization. And let's go through this. The characteristics of civilizations. One, you need social classes. More than just hunters and gatherers, more than just basic farmings. You see there's social pyramid. As you go to the top, power becomes more concentrated, way less in population, but way more in power. And then, we don't need to go through all these specifics for ancient Egypt, but just know that it becomes what we call a hierarchy. Some groups are going to be more wealthy, more powerful, more important than others, and who's always down at the bottom to make up the vast majority of the population? Peasants. You have a government, more than just a simple chief or a headman. You can have a complex government with a bureaucracy with different levels to it, possibly, something as complicated as the Roman Senate. Religion, and again, not just the basic worshiping of nature, but complex organized religions. Could be polytheistic religions, such as Egypt or Greece, or it could be your big three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Writing is another very, very important one. Now, it could be a very different form of writing, but we think, here you see hieroglyphics from ancient Egypt, but the ability to record information, whether it's history, law, just social customs, very, very important for civilization. Job specialization, that kind of ties in again with social classes, right? As more social classes emerge, people are doing things other than just farming and hunting and things like that, merchants, artisans, craftsmen, and so forth. And lastly, art and architecture. Now, art can be very basic, but when we think of architecture, we think of kind of large-scale architecture. We think of the pyramids. We think of ziggurats in ancient Mesopotamia. We think of large temples, things of that nature. So, first civilizations always formed around river valleys. The reason why they form around river valleys is, one, because of transportation and trade. Okay, rivers allow for that, and also because of irrigation, because of the water, fresh water, mind you, not salt water, but fresh water that they can bring for crop production. And let's look at your four major river valley civilizations. You've got Egypt, you've got Mesopotamia, I'll just shorten this here, you've got the Indus River Valley, and you've got China. And it's important to know the rivers as well. Okay, you've got the Yellow River, Yangtze River a little bit, but we mostly talked about the Yellow River. You've got the Indus River, obviously that's why the Indus River Valley. You've got the Nile River in Egypt, and you've got your two in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, I am going to end it on this one just as a basic overview, and in the next one we are going to pick up with talking in more specifics about these major river valley civilizations.